In this video I would like to make brief comments about the chapter 5 of the book Superior, The Return of Race Science by Angela Saini, and the chapter 5 is titled Race Realists. But first I would like to mention a Hegelian movement which I myself discovered through my intellectual development. In the West, one begins by thinking that race is a social construct. Race is a natural determination, biological determination, and society is a spiritual, from objective spirit in Hegel's encyclopedia, determination. So that's the first idea that is taught to us. Then by reading, studying, getting on the internet, one quickly realizes that actually society is a racial construct. Then by moving forward, one realizes that spirituality is a racial construct, that each native group of ethnic people have their own blend and their own type of spirituality. Christianity or even Islam may be universal, but depending on each ethnic group, it has its particular flavor, one might say. And then the trip is not over, the journey is not over, because one ends up realizing that race is actually a spiritual construct. It is spirit, which is the all manifested presence in the world, which sets and determines race. That's a very speculative, very difficult idea to grasp, but this is the truth. So we begin by saying that race is a social construct, and through a movement of negative and inversion and spiritual development, we end up at the conclusion that race is actually a spiritual construct, and spirit wants to recognize itself everywhere on earth, so it must accept and even love all the races. But that's the final stage. And the path which leads to this consideration and this view of reality is the path of the negative, which means separation, differentiation, and even hatred sometimes. So I would like to briefly talk about eugenics. If we adopt a cosmological Darwinian view of the cosmos, which is not the one I have, but I try nonetheless to explain from this point of view. Eugenics, the birth of eugenics at the end of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century is, as Schelling says, we are nature philosophizing, and Fichte, the German philosopher, says that we are, humans are windows of consciousness upon nature. Humans are the mirror which enable natures through consciousness to reflect upon herself and to know herself. So the birth of eugenics in the movement of consciousness is the moment when nature, when man, which is the result of the laws of nature, become conscious of its own capability of progress, because there is progress in nature through Darwinian evolution from the inferior to the superior organisms, but it's an unconscious process. In the Darwinian view, no one had planned this to happen. It happened just like that. But the eugenics movement is the moment from a cosmological viewpoint where nature, through the consciousness that it has of itself, of herself, in man, becomes conscious of the possibility to self-improve and to direct the laws of nature, of which thinking man is a manifestation, to enhance the potentiality for the increase of qualitative and elevation of nature itself. So this is an idea which is philosophical, and one could write a philosophy of eugenics. And William Pierce, the cosmotheist author, understood that so well. He had a cosmic view of evolution and the evolution of consciousness, and he understood that Darwinism and eugenics were moments in the self-consciousness of nature herself, and that we, according to him, should become the self-conscious agents of a natural process of evolution and self-selection and improvement and self-elevation towards higher levels of consciousness. That was just a brief thing that I wanted to say. The book says that, of course, the distinctions between the races in the history of thought are quite arbitrary, and there are no two anthropologists which are strictly in accordance with one another. But one could say that it's the whole process of science. Science builds itself and constructs itself and improves itself by making errors and by negating the errors while integrating the errors and the truths of the past authors and reshaping them, aufheben them mean to negate and to preserve. And the distinction between light and matter in physics is quite arbitrary also. Is it particles or waves? We do not know, but it doesn't mean that light or matter do not exist. It's simply that it's difficult to set a precise distinction, and the chemical elements in the history of chemistry have also been arbitrary sets, and there have been ignorance and gaps and lack of knowledge, and the whole history of chemistry and alchemy is a process of self-unfolding and self-conceptualizing of the elements of the physical world. And one wouldn't say that because in the history of chemistry chemists have been in disagreement with one another that chemistry does not exist, or there are no chemical elements. So, but that's what people say about race. So the idea that the various racial anthropologists are in disagreement with one another is not an argument against the process of science. It's a moment of science, and every science functions by making errors which are aufgehoben. Yeah, so I will quote sentences from the books and give broad, brief comments. She talks about Mankind Quarterly, which is a far-right fringe of academia and the Pioneer Fund, but her point of view is that racial science is a product of power, and those who promote what is called race realism, people like Richard Lynn, there's also what's his name, Dutton, Edward Dutton, there's also Charles Murray in the Bell Curve. He doesn't deal on the topic, but he mentions it briefly. Tatu Van Hanen. There's Heiner Rinderman and many others. She says though, so that this resurgence of race realism is a product of power and a will to dominate, and it is financed by certain groups of wealthy individuals who want to promote a political agenda. But what she doesn't see is that the anti-racist science, those who want to negate the concept of race, are infinitely more powerful in terms of financial resources, influence, widespread belief in the academia, and they are also financed by those who have those who control the money supply. So it's kind of weird to say that the race realists want to impose a political agenda and not consider that the anti-racist race deniers do not want power and do not want to impose a political agenda. It's a struggle for power, and in a struggle for power you always accuse the other of wanting power, but it is you who wants power, and what you don't like about the other is that he prevents you from having power. So race is a question of power in the sense of racial ideology manifests the political power in dominance at a certain time, and in the modern West, for now, the dominant power is anti-racist, and they promote false in a sense that it is not in accordance with the facts, but it is a moment of the revelation of truth. But yeah. There's an ideological continuity between the old and the new, but as Hegel teaches us, when something returns, it is not the same thing that we had before, because if it returns, it means that it has been lost in the process, and now that it returns, it has incorporated within itself the negative moment, which has made it fall into, in this case, into disrepute and into lack of consideration. So the new race science, which is a resurgence of the old race science, has been mediated by the progress of science, by the refutations brought about against race realism, and now it can become widespread thanks to the internet, and it can influence the minds of millions of people who can become aware of their own racial determinations and ethnic determinations. Yeah, so the resurgence of race science in the 1950s and 60s, 70s is a resurgence of pre-war scientific racial studies. And in my personal development, I realized that between symbolically 1859 and 1945, between the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species and the end of Second World War, race science had been thriving and became very influential, and it stopped all of a sudden with the defeat of Nazi Germany. But from a Hegelian standpoint, a political defeat is not an argument against truth. So you can dislike what the Nazis or the Japanese did about racial science and how they perverted it or manipulated it or used it to horrendous ends, but it is not because that's a moral condemnation that the body of science is not correct. So Hegel tells us that history is rational, and we should look at the world with the eyes of the mind and not with that of moral judgments, which of course is the most difficult thing to do, but this is what gives man the ability to know the truth, and the truth is God. And yeah. So she says that the internet has enabled like-minded people with extreme views to easily find each other. It was so amazing to me, says a journalist, that they would be so well networked, because it's a network of consciousness, and the rise of the consciousness of race identity, racial identity on the internet, which has been suppressed on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and the main media of social network, but reappears on censored and fringe websites, is the movement, is part of the movement of world spirit coming to consciousness of itself. So yeah, I will stop there for now. I will make another video because I have other things to say, but just to conclude briefly, the moment of racial consciousness is a step in the process of world spirit coming to consciousness of itself, and without this resurgence of racial science, it is impossible to understand the modern world. And spirit, in order to understand itself, needs this moment in his self-development. So that's what I had to say.